Are you cold, forlorn, and hungry? Are there lots of things you lack? Is your life made up of misery? Then dump the bosses off your back. Are your clothes all torn and tattered? Are you living in a shack? Would you have your troubles scattered? Then dump the bosses off your back. Are you almost split asunder, loaded like a long-eared jack? Boob, why don't you buck like...
I'm Quentin Sear, a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. We're a society of which a project is the self-criticism, self-mitigation, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. And we attempt to do that through panels that present different perspectives within the left, a reading group, and the PR review, so the Platypus Review, which you can find on that table over there when you exit, if you're so inclined to check it out. So yes, welcome to this panel on the politics of work. To my right is Shay Nzuga, a former food service worker in Halifax and member of Barista Rise Up, which is a work-led union movement that is organizing baristas and trying to improve work condition and industry standards in the food industry in Halifax. Despite being rather new to the labor movement and union organizing, she has had several years' experience organizing around issues of gender and sexuality. To her right is George Defensis, who is an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine and a founding member of the Midnight Notes Collective. He is a member of Strike Debt and active in the debtors movement in the US. His latest book, In Letters of Blood and Fire, Work Machine and the Crisis of Capitalism, which I think you're aware can be found to my left. And to his right will be Larry Haven, who is a professor in the Department of Management at St. Mary's University, not so far from here. And is director of the Masters of Management Cooperative and Credit Unions. He teaches industrial relations, human resource management, and publishes actively in these areas in cooperation with his wife pretty often. He's a research associate at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and is on the Nova Scotian National Board of that organization. Larry used to be a trade union staffer and has extensive experience in union organizing, collective bargaining, and work here at Foxfish. He's a specialist in the fields of industrial conflict, in the public sector debt, and in the sector of healthcare. I will begin by asking a series of questions which were posed to the panelists prior to the panel, give a little bit of context. Then each panelist will have a 15-minute presentation in which they address these questions or stray from them a little bit. They are quite exhaustive and plentiful, so we don't expect all of them to be addressed. So, question number one. How do you characterize work, employment, and employment as a political issue in contemporary society? What is wrong with unemployment? And what is wrong with work? Question number two. A distinction is often drawn between work as a purposefully human activity, on one hand, and work in the sense of labor and capitalism, where the worker undertakes purposeful activity for money under threat of material scarcity. Is this distinction politically relevant when thinking about work in a free society? Would your work manifest in one or both of these senses? Question three. If the widely observable phenomenon of overwork and unemployment is a necessary feature of capitalist society, why and how is it so? What kind of social necessity in the present organization of the world do you take to be underlying this phenomenon? Then, given your understanding of the nature of this necessity, what would it mean to radically transform it? Question number 4. In the history of the left, what examples do you regard as informing your attitude toward the politics of work and unemployment today? And what is relevant about these touchpoints? Question number 5. Historically, the left has sought to remedy the problems of overwork and unemployment through various means. Full employment, a guaranteed minimum income, regardless of employment, and shorter working hours for those employed. Which of these, if any, do you consider to be adequate responses, and how, if at all, should the left pursue them? Question 6. If the abolition of wage labor should indeed be a goal of emancipatory politics, what form of politics or concrete demand should be pursued to attain this goal? How do we get from here to there? 7. Given the breadth of the issue and struggle pursued by the left historically and today, race and racism, gender equality, environmental concerns, globalization, militarism, etc., what is the relationship between politics of work and the broader project of social emancipation? Exactly how central or peripheral is the politics of work to social emancipation as such? Question 8. Where do you find the most promising attempt by the left to address the issues of work and unemployment today? What makes this contemporary work relevant and propitious? 9. What role, if any, do you assign to political organization, such as an actual or potential political party, in working to progressively transform contemporary relations of work and unemployment? What should the relation between any such organization and the working class be? And finally, a century ago, these questions were consciously taken up by a politically constituted worker movement in which socialists and Marxists participated. Today, discussion on this topic is becoming utopian in the apolitical sense of the term. How, if at all, has the decline of worker movement and the death of the left circumscribed our ability to engage politics of work in the present? So that's it for questions, and I think we should begin with. Oh, sorry. Then, Shay, do you want to begin? Sure.
All right. So I'm coming to this talk tonight as a worker, a member of Baristas Rise Up, and also as someone who is engaged and invested in liberatory struggles. And most importantly, I am here tonight as someone who is interested in continuing and deepening the conversation about the left and workplace struggles. I was asked to speak because of my recent experiences with union organizing this summer, and preparing for this panel gave me an opportunity to think more in depth about the mechanisms and intentions behind the organizing drives at Just Us and Second Cup and other locations, and also allowed me to explicitly consider what are our long-term goals and vision. To begin, I can certainly say that when myself and a few other coworkers met with an SEIU organizer in my kitchen one January afternoon, none of us thought, this will be a good strategic move for the labor movement. Indeed, I don't think any of us really knew that much about unions, not to mention the state of labor in Nova Scotia or Canada more generally. I am engaged and invested in workplace organizing primarily because my life circumstances threw me into it, and the luxury of offensive strategic planning is arguably a luxury that is not often afforded to a left on the defensive, and more directly, a luxury not often afforded to disempowered, precarious, and low-wage workers. So when we first began about talking about organizing our workplace, it was simply because we were a group of workers with a basic sense of the need for dignity, respect, and justice at work. After recent experiences, now I believe that truly dignified work can never fully exist under capitalism. And so for me, for workplace struggles to be truly liberatory, they must also, by their nature, be anti-capitalist struggles. And in my talk tonight, I'm going to touch on some of the inherent contradictions that I think that co-ops and unions both experience, the dual roles that unions can play, and also the task of the revolutionary left in workplace struggles. I want to start by going out on a limb and arguing that unions and co-ops experience many similar limitations while they continue to operate within a capitalist framework. First, I want to be very clear and state that I truly believe that the founders of the Justos Co-op, the co-op I'm going to talk about because it's the one I am most familiar with, truly intended to create a co-op grounded in social justice values. I believe this. I think that they failed at their task, not to necessarily any fault of their own, but because of the constraints of operating a business within a capitalist economy. So if you'll entertain me for a moment, according to basic Marxist economic theory, there are two forms of capital. There is constant capital, things like machines, buildings, raw material, and variable capital, which is labor power. Profit is a function of the relationship between these two forms of capital. It is derived from the creation of surplus value. And where does surplus value come from? It is the time that workers spend selling their labor power to capitalists to increase the value of raw material. Therefore, profit is the creation of value for which workers are not paid. Thus, any business with a profit mandate is inherently engaging in an exploitative relationship because the creation of profit relies on exploitation. Moreover, in order for a profit-driven business to survive, constant capital must expand. And herein lies one of the basic paradoxes and contradictions of capitalism. Increased investment in constant capital reduces the rate of profit. Survival of a business then becomes a function of sheer magnitude and capacity to dominate a market. In order to remain an economically viable business, Justos had to expand or die. And then it became trapped in the capitalist logic of expansion. While Justos increased the magnitude of its profit, it also triggered a declining rate of profit because of the increased investment in constant capital, which in turn led to increasingly exploitative labor practices. The workers found themselves running on a treadmill that was constantly speeding up beyond their capacity to catch up. This is because the only way around a declining rate of profit is to increase the rate of exploitation. Operating a business, however ethical it may want to be, in Canada necessarily means existing within a capitalist structure and reproducing exploitative power circuits. And workers are left with a limited menu of responses. They can either suck it up, quit, or resist. I want to be clear and say that I do think that co-ops have many positive value. While engaged in the project of tearing down the old, we need to hold space for imagining the new. Alternative structures, such as co-ops, sometimes offer short-term intermediary solutions and, most importantly, provide tangible examples that other systems are indeed possible. What I don't think they will ever do is directly shift larger structures of power while they continue to operate within them. I also think that unions face similar inherent contradictions. Similar to businesses, unions are also dues-based organizations. Although more democratic and accountable than many large-scale businesses, unions are also employers and organizations that need to remain economically sustainable. Apart from an ideological commitment to the working class, many unions financially prioritize internal service provision over external organizing. And out of the many unions in this province, there are only a handful of paid full-time organizers. The reality is that organizing is an expensive endeavor, and I have heard informal estimates that it costs approximately $1,000 to organize one worker. There is a reason that the public sector is the most highly organized sector in Canada, and it is not because they are the most exploited workers. It is just simply a better financial investment for unions to organize moderate and high-waged workers. Moreover, as bureaucracy inflates, union staffers move further and further away from their rank-and-file members. It's commonly understood that rank-and-file union members are usually more radical and militant than union leaders. And honestly, I think that is because rank-and-file members have less invested in capitalism itself. Unions, so long as they are also organizing within a capitalist economy, will therefore have an inherent investment in capitalism itself. Returning to Marx, The bourgeois state is defined as the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. Unions, in their present form, have found themselves in the precarious position of buffering the class antagonisms between the ruling and working class. While unorganized workers and rank-and-file union members have a lot to gain from class struggle, many labor leaders instead seek to maintain labor peace, or at the very least, confine it to periods of struggle to the one legally allowed striking period contained within a collective agreement. I think that a common example of this perspective is the propaganda line, "Unions don't want to hurt the business." The logic underpinning this is that in order for a union to have workers to represent, well, they need a place to work. Although I have personally experienced this to be an effective counter-argument when organizing in a sector that is traditionally unorganized, like the food service industry, I think that if extended to its fullest potential, it is a dangerous logic. Why? Because it conflates the interests of the union with the interests of the bosses. I believe that we need unions that disrupt instead of reinforce our economic system. Why? Because we need to struggle to free ourselves from the chains of wage slavery, not for better chains. At worst, business unionism buys into and reinforces the bourgeois idea that equitable jobs, for some, are possible under capitalism. So how can we move forwards? To begin with, I think that we need to understand that unions are tools. Moreover, we need to understand that unions are imperfect tools that are most effective when utilized with a clear understanding of their functions and limitations. And primarily, I see unions fulfilling two key functions in anti-capitalist struggle. The first is that unions extract resources from the capitalist class to the working class. And this is the better job role that unions play. The second is that unions extract power from the ruling class to the working class. And this is the educating, empowering, and radicalizing role that unions can play. At their least revolutionary, unions seek only to extract resources. You get better jobs. You get healthcare, overtime, paternal leave, etc. This approach is primarily a line of defense against the declining rate of profit and the increased exploitation of workers, which I touched on earlier. I want to be clear and state that I do believe that material gains and improved working conditions, especially for the most marginalized and exploited workers, are worthy wins in and of themselves. Moreover, I think that the extraction of resources is necessary if we are going to be able to strengthen our forces and continue our fight. However, I am merely arguing that a struggle only for material gains that lacks a deeper analysis of capitalism and a larger vision for revolutionary change will do nothing to fundamentally challenge the exploitative wage system that underpins the current state of work. I think that Farrell Dobbs, writing in Teamster Rebellion about organizing truck drivers in Minneapolis in the 1930s, put it best when he said, "Every strike settlement is a compromise in the sense that it leaves bosses in control of the industry and free to exploit workers." At best, I believe that unions can be a training ground for revolutionary forces. In terms of my own personal experience, the organizing drive at Just Us was a win, not only because of material gains such as worker control of tips, but because we directly experienced a shift of power from bosses to workers. This is the most important experience that I think that a union can offer to workers. Workers have an opportunity to become militant during a union drive, collective bargaining, or a strike. Because those experiences teach workers the power of collective action. The experience of shifting power offers a small glimpse of what can be won on a larger scale. And these small workplace wins mean a huge emotional and ideological victory. And while I do think that unions have an important role to play in revolutionary anti-capitalist struggles, I don't want to make the mistake of conflating unions with revolutionary movements. Unions on their own cannot and never will be a revolutionary force. Why? First, because of their inherent investment in capitalism and the contradictory role that they play in class antagonisms. And secondly, because they are broad-based organizations with workers of diverse political opinion, not a revolutionary force built around a center of shared political affinity. This is why I think it is vitally important for radicals and revolutionaries to engage in workplace struggles. Not only do we need radicals and revolutionaries working within unions, but we also need unions that ally themselves with larger movements for social and economic liberation. If disconnected from a coherent left with a long-term revolutionary vision, unions will only maintain and reinforce our current exploitative economic system. May Day emerged out of the struggle for the 8-hour day and the 40-hour work week. Now, over 100 years later, instead of, say, fighting for a 30-hour work week without a reduction in wages, we are instead experiencing an interesting phenomenon where workers are calling for more work. Many food service workers in Canada and the United States are demanding full-time employment because it will relieve low-wage workers of the economic precarity and instability of fluctuating part-time schedules. Rather than an economy that sees a wage workforce composed of largely male and largely full-time workers, like the one in which unions first emerged, instead, young workers today are entering in an economy where we find ourselves temping, freelancing, or doing contract work and unpaid internships, or juggling multiple part-time jobs instead of finding a stable full-time union job with benefits. Isolated, these situations mean material scarcity for individual workers, and together a structural declawing of the one tool that is available to workers, unions. This is intentional. As the workforce shifts, unions need to develop dynamic and flexible organizing tactics and strategies. But the task for radicals and revolutionaries engaged and invested in workplace struggles is to develop an analysis that extends beyond work and wages. Pairing workplace organizing with a revolutionary vision offers a potentiality for organizing which is not limited to the contradictions of capitalism, but that instead utilizes them. If full employment would destabilize our economic system because capitalism relies on unemployment and a reserve army of labor, that is not an argument against pursuing full employment. That is a broken economic system. If organizing precarious and low-wage workers is economically unsustainable because we can't afford to pay them livable and dignified wages, that is a broken wage system. These are not arguments against workplace organizing, but arguments for it. I think that we cannot allow these arguments to immobilize us. Instead, we need to turn them on their heads and allow them to push us forwards. For the self-emancipation of the working class, first, we need to learn how to understand ourselves as workers, and then we need to learn how to move beyond an identity which is fundamentally rooted in our location in a capitalist economic structure. Because yes, we are workers, but we are also so much more. Thank you.
Next.
Consensus?
Okay. I'm happy to be here, and I thank the Platypus Society for organizing a gathering to discuss in some detail in a very sophisticated way. Thank you very much, and I'm sure Larry will also speak and make an important contribution to the issue of work, which is, in some ways, one can't speak about politics in a capitalist society unless we speak about work. So, I'm really pleased that we have the possibility to be together and discuss not only the issues that you've been bringing up concerning the question of employed work and the problems of work in the workplace, with the recognition that there's another conception of work that's much wider than employed work. The way in which work has been understood in the questions that were brought to us that our Platypus Society people sent to us to answer. And there was a particular conception of work that the more than 40 years of political organizing and thinking that I've been involved with has really challenged. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit tonight about how I understand work and how this conception of work I think is important to deal with because it's only when we understand work in its fullest extent can we really begin to develop a type of capitalist, anti-capitalist struggle that we are thinking about, as you are, Shay. The point that I want to make is that often in our society, employed work is work. It's basically if you are getting a wage, if you have written a contract of some sort with your employer, if this contract was not coerced, you're not under the gun, then that's work. Okay, and if you don't have those kinds of conditions, then you're unemployed. All right, that's the idea of the conception of work that you also find in much of Marxism. Okay? But in the history of the struggles against capitalism, movements, important and powerful movements that have challenged the capitalist system have not only come from employed workers or unemployed or workers who had been employed and then became unemployed. For example, the feminist movements have brought forward the recognition that, in fact, the most important work that goes on in a capitalist society is largely unwaged, is invisible. But it's obviously crucial because if it didn't go on, if the child care, if the everyday life is not reproduced, then in fact there are no workers to exploit. Okay? So the feminist movement blew up this very well-defined but very limited conception of work that was to be found in the anti-capitalist movement in the 19th and into the 20th century. And it's very important, the reverberations of that explosion are still with us today. And it's still with the Marxist influenced part of the anti-capitalist movement, how it's to be brought together. And also, of course, this recognition that was brought, and again, this nature is literally an explosion, theoretically, was from the anti-colonial movement, the Black Power movement, that challenged the view that the work that goes on in a capitalist society is only wage work. First, they reminded us that work for most of the history of capitalism from, let's say, 1500 into the late 19th century was in large part, in fact, unwaged coerced labor. Slavery, as we call it here in the United States. And then in colonial time, in the colonial period especially, down to the 1950s and 60s, much of the work that went on in Africa and in Asia was, in one sense or another, coerced labor. And this was the source of tremendous wealth of capitalism. This was not like a minor little thing. In fact, there are always many scholars attempt to show us, oh, it wasn't so important and so on. Nonsense. It was really basic. So we have to be careful, because when we say we want to abolish wage labor, yes, we do, but we don't want to have slavery. That was on wage labor. So it's very important for us to now see that actually when we take a step back and begin to see that actually if we think of the world of work as that screen, then actually maybe the part that is involved with waged, uncoerced, basically legal labor, okay, that is contractual, is really a relatively small part of the full space. And it's important for us to recognize that, because within these different types of labors that we find in the whole field, there's also a hierarchy and a set of divisions that are organized. Who will be doing the slave work? Who will be doing the housework and the child care and so on? Who will be doing the employee work? These are questions that the capitalist society answers in such a way as to continually divide the working class. And so it's therefore really quite crucial that we understand that the field of labor, sometimes I call it the kind of the manifold, the many folds, the many possible ways in which labor exists in our society, we've been looking at it through a little input. And now, once we open up, we begin to see that the politics of work begins to change as well. I mean, we have, of course, the important politics of work that, for example, involve the attempt to create uncoerced labor organizations, so labor unions could organize and so on. So there's a lot of politics of work that revolve around unions and so on. But there's a lot of other politics of work that don't express themselves as politics of work. You know, take the issue, for example, of the immigrant labor who is demanding legal recognition of themselves. What in fact they're asking, it's a labor issue, because in fact that's exactly the problem that immigrants face. They face the fact that since they have to work under illegal conditions, they in fact cannot protect themselves when their employers, for example, refuse to pay for their labor. Similarly, just even a simple question like the decriminalization of marijuana. Someone has to gather. It's a crop like any other. So, in a way, that too has a labor aspect of the politics of legalization of marijuana. In fact, I would suggest that if you take this wider view of what what work is, you begin to see that in fact there's almost no political issue that is not a politics of work. And it would be important for us to recast many of the questions that are presented as issues of ethics and morality and so on, to put it in questions of work. I think if we do that, we begin to not only decode our society, but also see the kind of organizational problems that we're facing at this point. Because it's true that the anti-capitalist movement is facing some grave difficulties. Many of us thought that in 2008, with the financial crisis, this would be a tremendous moment of impulse to the anti-capitalist movement. but in fact we discovered that that has not happened as we expected, and that we need to be sure to get back to rethink the basics. And one of the basics that we must rethink is work. Now, I also wanted to bring up not only expanding our conception of work, but also I wanted to bring up another aspect of thinking about work in this period of history of the anti-capitalist movement that often thinks that work is passé, that there is now sort of workers are superfluous in a society that is increasingly mechanized, computerized. And that view, I think, often that's the way in which the reasons why the anti-capitalist movement is not succeeding has to do with the fact that, in fact, workers are no longer needed in our society. I'm sure you've heard this argument before. And of course, if it were true, then capitalists, of course, since they did not need our labor, when we deny that labor, when we refuse that labor, it would have no impact on the system, or at best a marginal impact. But I would then take a look. I would say, in counter to that view, I would say first, you're not really talking about the full amount of labor that goes on in our society. Much of it is not mechanizable at all. When you think about, for example, child care, you see that the idea of getting a mama bot or health care, when you want to get a nurse bot, you begin to recognize that, in fact, a tremendous amount of labor in our society that goes on, it's absolutely essential, is not mechanizable at all. And moreover, as you pointed out in your very fine return to the basics, which I really love, and I'm glad I've come to Nova Scotia to get to the kind of texts that I love and have shaped my thinking. Because although I think I've been part of a movement that has expanded what Marx had to say, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's still questions of surplus value are really quite crucial in understanding what capitalism is about, because it's not about creation of things. It's a creation of values, as Marx points out. And these values depend upon labor. They're quite crucial, so I appreciate your point. But the labor that's dependent is not necessarily the labor that's in the workplace, because in some ways the workplace for us in our society now it is everything. And therefore, in one sense, the struggle that is always implicit in labor, right? Whenever there's any work going on in the capitalist society, there's always a struggle. On the job, you see it all the time. Okay? On the job, you see it all the time. But I would say that if you look at other, let's say, for example, what Sylvia's brought out, Silvia Federici has brought out in a number of works, the kind of work that goes on in a home for bringing up a child has a two-sided aspect as well. An aspect that basically is involved in training the child to adapt to the society that he or she is going to be living in, and at the same time giving that child the power to refuse, the power to say And that division, and anyone who's a parent here, well, all of us are parents or children of parents, know that that's very much part of the way the struggle of everyday life takes place. And so what I want to kind of conclude, because I think it's important for all of us to kind of get, is to say that there's a tremendous amount of work that's not passé, and most importantly, we now recognize that in order for there to be investment in one part of capitalism, for, say, technological advances, there has to be, in another part of capitalism, the increase in very low wage labor, low technologically developed labor, that they call low organic composition parts. In fact, the more you have high capital intensive sectors of the society, the more you need low organic composition areas, places where most of the work is being done without cheap. So this has got to happen, otherwise the system will fall apart. And in fact, that's what we see. We see in our society and in a number of other capitalist societies in Europe a high level of mechanization. But then we've also seen throughout the planet a tremendous increase in the labor, factory labor, mining labor, and so on, are the most under conditions that rival what we saw in the era of slavery and colonialism. So there's a lot to say. I look forward to comments, discussions, and so on.
Thanks. So when I was given the 10 questions, I treated them more like rather than like the 10 commandments, I treated them like the 10 suggestions. You know, and I thought, I'm working on something, that's what I really want to concentrate on. So I'll try and keep my remarks fairly short so that we can get into this. But I'll maybe do a little preface, and I'll start out, because one of the questions was, what were the formative influences, both intellectual and experiential, that brought you to the way you think about work? So we'll talk about those a little bit. The first influence was being from a working class family. But it wasn't, I grew up, my father, both my real father and my stepfather were industrial workers. One was a cutter in a clothing factory, the other was a baker. They were both trade unionists, so I grew up with that. And yet, my stepfather then became a small business person, which is real education, to see both the working class and the owning class. I mean, he didn't become a highly exploitative, huge capitalist, but in his own way. And the way he thought, the way the working class thinks and the way the employing class thinks was very interesting to watch. And I'll come back to that issue about the way people think as my final formative influence. The second formative influence is in my early 20s, being part of a left-wing organization back in the 60s, early 70s, we, of course, many of us went to work in factories. Partly because we thought we were going to rescue the working class, but boy, was that ever an interesting and valuable experience. Just to have to show up at work every day. And I listened, and you should all maybe try and listen to the recording of the Same Politics of Work forum that they did in UMass Amherst with Stanley Aronowitz and several others. And Stanley Aronowitz, who also worked in a factory for more years than I did, said, yeah, wage labor sucks. And not to put too fine a point on it, it does. And it's not just how hard you work. And it's not just the smallish amount of money you make, because actually in those days, working in a unionized factory, you got a dental plan. That's not something you could get ordinarily. But it was the experience of being under somebody's thumb and being told what to do and knowing you didn't have any choice but to obey. The only saving grace was the knowledge that if I chose to, I could get out of there. And I did. But I didn't get out of there to become sort of the opposite. I became a trade union organizer, which is the third foundational influence on me, because for 12 years I was a trade union staffer organizer for various unions, public sector, private sector, and I explored. It was the greatest moment of my life, I think, in the sense that I got to organize people. I got to use the skills I had developed. I got to limit the possibilities of organizing workers to fight back, and not only the possibilities but the limitations. And again, I ran into the problem. It's not only the material conditions, but it's how people think. But being a true Marxist at the time, I didn't believe in superstructure. I believed in infrastructure, the base. Economics determines all. And I couldn't see what was lying right in front of me. And then I went off and became better educated. And I became a scholar, I guess, although I like to think of myself as an activist scholar or public intellectual. And I encountered some wonderful thinking and writing, which at the time, in the early 80s, had to do with the rediscovery by the intellectual left of the labor process. I shouldn't just say, I guess Harry Braverman was an intellectual, even though he was a factory worker as well. It started off with his book, Labor and Monopoly Capital, in which he rediscovered, after 100 so years, Marx's concept of the labor process. Briefly, that you can gather a bunch of workers together in a factory, as capital did, and you can exploit them, but that's only, formal subordination of labor. The real subordination of labor comes when the employer learns how to control everything the workers do. And talking about the politics of work, one of the scholars that really influenced me was Michael Burrowoy, an English Marxist scholar of work, whose very influential first book was called Manufacturing Consent, not to be confused with Noam Chomsky's book of the same name, which was written later. And his second book was called The Politics of Work. And in the book, he explained how work is the regulation of work, the fight over who's going to control work, is a political process. And then finally, I became a university professor, and I'd say the fifth foundational influence was having a son, Max, who got into cultural studies. Now, as a diehard materialist, somebody who could not be convinced that what people thought was important, or I acknowledged it, but in the long scheme of things. And Braverman is terrible in this regard. He was a strong materialist. We tend to give short shrift to what people are thinking. However, under the influence of Max, I began to think about what people think and how they think about work, and realized that, and I'll talk about it more when I make my larger presentation. I try to redefine Marx's concept of the value of labor power. And in other words, what is labor worth? Well, that depends, of course, on the market, but it also depends on what workers think they're worth. A sense of entitlement, in the good sense of the word, not the bad sense. We always hear that entitlement is bad. Well, it's good. It's a good thing. If workers think they're entitled to more, they'll fight for more. If they think they're entitled to less, then they will give up more easily. And you know, how they conceive of what their worth is in the labor market is as important to determining the value of labor power as anything else. So those are the 5 foundational influences. A couple of other points. One of the things that shows that work is all about politics. It's both work as a political process, and the politics, the formal politics, also has to do with work. I did some work with an economist, and we looked at the question of, gee, can we as a society afford social services? I ran into an assistant deputy minister of the province of Saskatchewan, the province that began Medicare, and he was working for the NDP. And I said, this is about 15 years ago, I said, you look down. And he says, yeah. He says, we can no longer afford Medicare. This is Assistant Deputy Minister of Health. I said, gosh, has Nova Scotia become a poorer province? He says, yeah. I said, I don't think so. Now, this is not rocket science. I went and looked it up. You look at Statistics Canada. By gosh, Saskatchewan was an incredibly wealthy province compared to what it was in 1962 when Medicare got started, one of the foundations of the Canadian welfare state. Fantastically more wealthy in terms of GDP per capita. So I thought, well, that's wrong. But most people believe that we can no longer afford it. By hell, we can afford it. We're better able to afford all of these things than we could in the past. Can we pay workers more? Of course we can pay workers more because productivity has been increasing. So along with an economist, we actually took a pretty careful look at productivity and prosperity in Nova Scotia. And what we discovered that in the good 25 years between 1981 and 2000 and the onset of the recession, that prosperity in Nova Scotia had increased, that is in GDP per capita in real terms, by about 60%. We were 60% richer as a society defined by our borders as we were in 1981. That was mostly because productivity, that is output in dollars per worker hour, was up by about 40%. So, and Nova Scotia and Canada are not huge, we're not way out there in productivity terms, but all economic units in good economic times become very productive. And yet, and at the same time, we looked at real weekly income of workers, and we found out that it was not only stagnant, it had dropped. In the 25 years between 1981 and 2007, the average weekly income of workers had dropped. Their paycheck bought less in 2007 than it did in 1981. So then the next question is, where did that money go? Well, my colleague, my collaborator, being an economist, has this wonderful bag of tricks, which those of you who want to study economics know that economics is not just a bourgeois profession. You could do a lot of damage with it to powers. Because what he did is he did these calculations and found that over that period, the amount of prosperity increases going to labor had dropped, and the amount going to capital had increased. Now, this will come as no surprise to any of you. It really didn't come as any surprise to me, but boy, then we had the goods. And I appear before audiences all the time and hopefully scare them out of their socks. And if I appear before trade unionists, then I can say the message is, this is yours. You have to go and claim it. So I'll end there, and you'll see more in my presentation.
Thank you for all of that. Now, if you'd like to take 5 minutes each, maybe to address points points brought up by the other panelists. Any observations?
Yeah. I think that both of you had like really interesting things to say. I was really, when you were talking about the sort of like sphere of what we consider work, like waste and uncoerced work, I don't have like a fully formed thought, but it sort of like triggered minds of thinking about what is like traditionally been like housework and care work, and what is like traditionally be considered like this sphere of woman work. I think it's like this interesting phenomenon, whereas like, you know, women fought for entrance into the waged workforce. There's also this sort of thing that happens where it's like values that are considered feminine, things like care work, and you're entering, and now women at work, they're in the workforce. There's also this thing where like, and we are experiencing increased technologicalization of work. The jobs that are least affected by technology are jobs that involve care work, jobs that involve human touch, things like customer service, healthcare, those sorts of things. But those jobs are also like increasingly devalued because they are considered feminized, and there's this like idea of like inherent values that women have, or inherently feminine values often associated to care, which then as they enter the workforce, like re-enshrine the hierarchies that already exist in the division between like waged and unwaged work. And so it's like, I liked your comment about, you know, if we want to abolish the wage system, do we want to go back to slavery? No, obviously that's not what we want. But how do we, I guess it like triggers for me a question of like, so how do we move forward if we are fighting for entrance into a wage system that is still, again, like reproducing hierarchies? And where is the liberatory goal from that? I don't know. That was just a thought that I wanted to respond to. I don't have an answer.
Well, one of the things that my response to it is that the way you work?
Oh, yes.
Okay. My response to your important, obviously very important question is that first and foremost, the work of women needs to be, and the work of reproductive efforts need to be revalued. And it's of the essence of capitalism that labor power in general be devalued. According to what you said, Shay, if you had very high value of labor and as a consequence, you reduce the amount of surplus value that is available to the capitalists. Well, you have a situation of capitalist crisis. Profitability reduces, and so therefore everything in the society is built to devalue labor. And one of the most important ways in which labor is devalued is through the devaluation of those who reproduce labor. This is the insight of the feminist movement and the work of Maria Rosa, Selma James, Sylvia here have, I think, developed. There's a logic to it. It's not, it's just, you can see the history of it, and you can see the playing out of that story in our everyday life. But it's a logical necessity. Remember, capitalism is not it's a system that has a quantitative character as well as a qualitative. And the profitability reduces to such a point where, in fact, it goes to zero. Then, in fact, the very system itself disappears. Now, what follows, who knows, will depend on how well organized people are. But and one of the most important requirements is, for this to happen, is that the work of those who reproduce labor power, both generationally and on an everyday basis, be dramatically increased. So that's Now, how you do it, Shay, in a way, I'm hoping to leave it to your generation to figure out. Because, as Larry here pointed out, the efforts that we've been doing in the last 30 to 40 years, in terms of class struggle, in terms of and because similar things can be said about the United States, in terms of who has gained from the tremendous increase in productivity, is also true in the U.S. And so, why this happened, there is no inevitability about it. There were historical conditions under which this happened. And it was absolutely important that it happened if capitalism was to survive. Because remember, there's nothing eternal about this system. It lives within certain parameters. When these parameters are violated, it puts up a fight, a tremendous fight. It's willing, I often joke in a kind of dark humor, that capitalists are willing to blow up half the planet to save 5 or 10% of their profits. And that we know that that's true. We live in a very murderous world with a very murderous class. We have to face the facts. So when the system is, and these basically fundamental ratios are violated or begin to be violated, then in fact it's a moment of tremendous danger. It's a tremendous danger for them, but it's also a tremendous danger for the rest of humanity. Okay, well, I've done my best.
That's great. Thank you.
Mr. Haven,
Yeah.
how long would your presentation be? Because you still.
Oh, I was just gonna just briefly raise something I liked, among other things, from Shay's presentation, and that is that both cooperatives and unions are highly problematic organizations. They, unions, of course, I've been in the union movement for a long time, and I know all of its warts. And I remember the day when one of the workers I represented got angry at me and said, you spend all your time telling us what we can't do, you spend very little time telling us what we can do. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's it. Boy, that had a tremendous impact. But both trade unions and co-ops, I've found, being an educator in both now, a trade union educator and a co-op educator, and that is, there is nothing about unions or co-ops that leads naturally to a higher level of consciousness about social justice, unfortunately. It has to be brought in a conscious way. Left to their own devices, trade unionists will fight maybe for more higher wages sometimes, if they think they're worth it. Cooperators will, if left to their own devices, probably just worry about making sure they get through the next day, that their enterprise survives. And yet so much can be done with people who are engaged in these enterprises. They are fundamentally progressive, and we just have to make sure that they remain so. I mean, the mere formulation of the 7 cooperative principles, talking about cultural studies, the mere formulation by the International Cooperative Alliance of the 7 cooperative principles is such an important cultural phenomenon as to beggar the imagination, really. And I'd like to do more research in this. Likewise, trade unionists, well trained in understanding the class nature of what they're involved in, can do amazing things as well. So, and then a point that George made that really struck home is the hierarchies that the ruling class, formulates or puts together among workers to divide them from one another. I mean, it's both obvious and not obvious, because how many times can we get fooled by the same thing? And when I talk to audiences about temporary foreign workers, which is a big problem in Canada, who are a form of indentured servitude, who are paid 15% less, that's legally, of course, illegally they do it even more. But when I talk to them, I have to be careful that my audience, especially working class audience, doesn't turn what I'm saying into a racist encouragement for them to be racist against immigrants. And so I have to point out that immigrants are different. They come here to stay and they work and they're entitled to the same citizenship. Anyway, so.
Mr. Cantus, did you have a note or comment to make about anything the other panelists have made?
I'm looking forward to, I think,
Okay. Mr. Haven, you had
You
a
want me to go
presentation
first?
remaining. Well, I'd like to save the last 30 minutes for questions from the public. So
Sure.
15 minutes should do very well.
Okay, being a business school prof, I have overheads. Well, one of the reasons I have overheads also is because what I'm going to talk about is a bit complex, and I'm trying to make it sort of as simple as possible. So I also have handouts. And the reason I have handouts is, in addition to the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, is that I always say that if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of my presentation, and then you can just look here and you'll know where I've been. And if you want to go back to sleep, you'll know where I'm going. So I'll just hand those out if you want to. Max, you want to grab those? Let me just set this up. University at the Writing Center. For those at the back, we'll read it. Somebody wrote, tell us what class are you struggling with and why? And somebody wrote, the bourgeoisie. Why? Because they control the means of production. And I thought, my university, that's great. Yeah, it's glorious. So, having handed it out, I'm not going to read these quotations, but the point here is that Marx was ambivalent. He went on both sides when it came to cooperatives. He was enormously enthused by the rise in the worker cooperative movement and also consumer cooperatives, primarily because they showed that bosses weren't necessary, at least capitalists weren't necessary to organize efficient, productive enterprises. And I love this quote, a musical conductor need in no way be the owner of the instruments in his orchestra, nor does it form part of his function as a conductor that he should have any part in paying the wages of the other musicians. So he was enormously enthused by cooperativism, and but he was somewhat skeptical, especially after the demise of the Paris Commune and the decline of some of the co-ops between 1860 and 1870. And so he came to the conclusion, not panning co-ops, but that restricted to dwarfish forms, the cooperative system will never transform capitalist societies, and what was needed was seizing of political power. So Marxists throughout the next 150 years have debated about cooperatives, and I've read most of the stuff that they've written, and they're really not much of a conclusion here. The debate still goes on. The most that Marxists have to say about co-ops is nothing. They've really ignored cooperatives. But really, you can, to be glib, you can break them down into two different groups. Those who believe socialism is a system of self-managed firms, and that therefore co-ops in some way are prefigurative of socialism, that socialism would consist of worker-managed firms, or that socialism is a state-planned command economy, and therefore they would see co-ops as actually eroding class solidarity because workers in a co-op would say, I'm all right, Jack. Everything's okay with me. Now, an interesting point of view that George has written about, and there's a wonderful article too by Greg Deputer and Nick Dyer-Witherford in an issue of the magazine Affinities. And again, this ambivalence. On the one hand, co-ops are seen as especially what they call the new cooperativism that's arisen in the past couple of decades. It's a people's space, a place where new and vibrant responses to the failures of neoliberalism can take place, fundamentally anti-corporate and anti-capitalist. And it's also a way of bringing the discussion about collective ownership back, and also a way of not talking about communism, which is another form of collective ownership. And because of the demise of the Soviet Union, nobody wants to talk about that anymore. So it's a way of at least starting to talk about collective ownership. But George has written a number of pieces which suggest that the commons, now you haven't written about co-ops as far as I know, but Dyer-Witherford and Deputer suggest that the whole idea of commonality and is much the same. That the idea of the commons is really at its worst Plan B for capitalism. In other words, when capitalism gets rampant in its cancer stage, rampant neoliberalism, we need the commons as a wellspring from which new ideas come forward, which at its worst just renews capitalism. Or to quote Deputer and Dyer-Witherford commenting on your piece, voluntary cooperation does not so much subvert capital as subsidize it. And then they observe that the talk about the commons really doesn't talk much about unions, solidarity, strikes, work, wealth, class, and poverty. So here's my little sort of modest attempt to bring those together. First of all, I think we have to reconceptualize what we mean by workers. And please, I welcome comments because this is sort of half-baked ideas that I'm trying to put together, I'm trying to explore. So if anybody feels that, wait a minute, that just doesn't work, tell me. But let me just go through it first and then okay, so I would reconceptualize the concept of workers as producers. In other words, producers are those who produce value, but produce it under conditions of subordination and dependency. Now, of course, we have traditional employed workers, which I would call the old subordination. It hasn't passed out of memory. A lot of people are still exploited in that way. But I would talk about also the new subordination, which includes a lot of self-employed people, especially in crisis. A lot of former workers become self-employed and do a lot of self-exploitation, and even some who employ others. Judy and I studied a very interesting fishing co-op in Newfoundland. It's a co-op. It's made up of fishers who go out and catch fish, and then and they even hire people to go with them. Sharemen, there's probably share women now, but they call them sharemen, and they negotiate with the buyers of fish over the price. They don't negotiate with an employer, and yet there is exploitation going on. So the point I'm trying to make is subordination and dependency are not necessarily hierarchic. Now, we understand the old kind of subordination that takes place in a factory where workers are brought together and the employer owns the means of production and seizes the value and then especially takes the surplus value and so that is what we call formal subordination of labor, but influenced by the labor process theorists, we know that the real subordination of labor in the factory came about through control of the labor process. So production in this model is the center of value creation, not consumption or distribution. And power, of course, flows downward, value flows upward, Everybody knows who the boss is. The nature of exploitation is somewhat hidden, but if you think the nature of exploitation is hidden there, imagine the new workplace. More and more places where work is done adheres to this model. So if you start at the beginning of the 20th century, take the typical Fordist plant. Ford's plant is a good example. Most of the product was produced in-house by employees, and very little was produced outside, and that was what made it so efficient. However, throughout the 20th century, you have the unraveling of what could be called the vertical firm into networks. And although, as I say, a lot of firms don't operate that way, many of them do. There are many industries that operate now on a network basis, where value doesn't flow upward from the worker to the boss. It flows from node to node. It flows from those nodes lacking resources into those nodes that have resources. And the stronger nodes can extract rent from the weaker. And I'll give you a few examples of things that I've studied. Taxi drivers, they're self-employed. Many of them own their own cabs, and some of them have other people working for them. But they are caught in a web, in a network, where value is extracted from them. So they may charge you to ride the cab, but they have to pay for cars and repairs and to the dispatcher, and they end up keeping very, very little of that. So even though they're self-employed, they're not in a traditional relationship, the value flows outward to those who have the resources that cab drivers need. Musicians, another good example. Not a new occupation and not a new method of working, but if you have the musician in the middle, they are beholden to all sorts of different centers and stronger nodes. And the film and video industry is an excellent example. It used to run on the Fordist model, but now it's all done by contract. They pull together a group of producers, and they're all self-employed, and when the production is over, they all disperse. And then they come together, not the same ones, different ones, they come together for another project. So how is value made? How is wealth created? Oh, it is. But it's not, it doesn't flow in the same way as a traditional industry. Okay, so I think we have to reconceptualize the word worker, which we understand as somebody who works in an employment relationship with somebody, as a producer, because a self-employed worker is a producer and still can be badly exploited. And then I move on to the Marxist concept of the value of labor power, which is something that's not that well known. It was suggested by Marx, and what it means is, of course, labor or labor power is a commodity with a value that rises and falls. In other words, the ability to what your labor power or your product is worth fluctuates, and sometimes it's worth more, sometimes it's worth less. But it's not the same as the wage, and it's not the same as income. The wage is part of it, but it consists of course, the wage, and what workers want is the wage, or the price of their product if they're self-employed, is put together in a very complex way as a psychological contract, a feeling of entitlement, as I mentioned before. And whether workers engage in struggle or concession depends on that psychological feeling they have about what they're worth, the past history of struggle, how well they're organized, how well they organize themselves. But it also consists of whoops, I can't show you that cartoon yet. It depends also on the social wage. Because what a worker receives, or what a producer receives, is not only from selling their product or their labor power, it also comes from what they get from the state or from the social economy. So in the United States, workers have to worry a lot about how they're going to pay for health insurance. In Canada, they don't yet. And that means a lot. It means that the value of labor power in Canada is actually higher, in a sense, than it is in the States, because that's something we don't have to bargain for. So it's all the necessities and amenities provided by the state and civil society. But also it's the price of what it takes to reproduce labor, what it takes to produce a family and get them to work every day or the next generation to work. And that's all about the reproduction of labor power. Okay, there's a cartoon. So, what I'm suggesting is the value of labor power has two sides. We usually think of the price of the output, what workers want as wages, or what producers want or expect or demand for their product. And that's conditioned by the labor market, the law, the sense of entitlement, but it also depends on the cost of inputs. What does it cost to keep a family going and get them into work, ready and able to work, either to produce goods or to produce goods for an employer, goods and services. And that is a whole bunch of things like food and housing, healthcare, other consumer goods, education, but also for producers, it's such as the fishers in this Newfoundland co-op, it's the cost of their boat, it's the cost of the gear and the tackle and everything they use, it's what they have to pay out. For a group of artists, it's what they have to pay for canvases. So that concept that if we broaden what we think of as the value of labor power, then we realize that you can increase the value of labor power by either raising the price of outputs or lowering the cost of inputs, or both. And this, I think, leads us to understand where the cooperative movement comes in.
Mr. Eden?
Yeah.
If you could stop at the next logical
Sure.
point of conclusion, maybe we'll-
Sure, maybe I'll just
questions on
finish
the
this
floor.
thought and not get into my thing on what co-ops are. So in order to do this, in order to both raise the price of the outputs, lower the cost of the inputs, producers, and among them workers, form collectivities to do both. They lower the cost of the inputs through purchasing power, buying groups. That's what consumer cooperatives are all about. The Rochdale Weavers, the first successful group of cooperators, formed a consumer cooperative, a store. But they were weavers. So you think, well, how did that help them? They should have been out there fighting for a higher pay for their weaving. Well, yeah, okay. But they decided that that was difficult, and so they came around and they put together a store, a cooperative store, where they could buy things cheaper at cost or get patronage refunds. And that actually lowered the cost of their inputs and thereby raised the price of their outputs. And of course, many organizations, including unions, raise the price of outputs through solidaristic activity, basically by withholding of labor or production. And some organizations do both. Producer cooperatives, consumer cooperatives. You know, when you stand far enough back, I think there are only really two types of cooperative. Producer cooperatives try and do both, lower the cost of inputs, raise the cost of outputs. And consumer outputs mostly concentrate on the input side. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we'll now begin with questions. Raise your hand. Front row.
Well, just a thought, if you want to expand on this, that would be great. You touched on sort of the divisions in the working class and the increasing space between sort of high technology, sort of low worker composition sort of enterprises in the sort of developed world, and increasingly sort of worker-intensive ventures in the third world. And I wonder how that, I wonder how the relation between those things shapes struggles in the first world and like how it affects the effectiveness of like unions and workplace organizing when like really like a McDonald's strike isn't going to shut down capitalism the same way a miners' strike would. And obviously in the first world, however, things like the reproduction of labor power in the home is increasingly done by workers from the third world. Huge concentration of Filipino domestic workers in Canada, for example. I guess I wonder about some of these racialized dynamics and sort of global geopolitical dynamics and how they affect the relevance of like formal like wage worker struggles in the first world.
That's a good piece of work there. Thank you very much for such a request. Let me just say that it's important to recognize that capitalism in response to struggles often invests in machinery to relieve the importance of labor power directed towards production. So it does that, but it's a double-sided problem. And this is where the issue of the fact that capitalism is interested not in the production of things, but in the production of values is the same. So that when there's an increase in what Marxists call the organic composition of capital, basically the ratio between the amount of capital that the machinery, let's say, versus labor increases. When that happens in response to a struggle, it's double-sided, because in effect, what begins to happen is that in those highly technological areas or firms, the amount of surplus value that's produced is really low. I mean, think about the nuclear power plants. You have billions of dollars of investment that goes into a nuclear power plant, but you might only have a couple hundred workers in the plant. Now that means that if you're going to get surplus value from that nuclear power plant, you can't get it from the 200 workers to make it profitable. So the way the system operates, and this is part of the fact that lots of things that happen in capitalism go behind our backs. In other words, what happens in a capitalist society is that in order for there to be an evening out of profitability, there has to be an opening up, for example, of areas of the world where surplus value is produced in a very substantial way and is transferred. And this is, so in other words, in a capitalist society, surplus value is produced for the class as a whole. There's a totality around capitalism that is often forgotten. We often see capitalists butting heads with each other in competition, and there is that's a very important aspect of capitalism. But there are also, the capitalists also form a class, and they have a common interest. And so what this point I'm making is that, yes, the response to a class struggle in what you call the first world involves often a response through increasing investment in mechanization, but in the process requiring the opening up of new fields of production that in fact have very low mechanization. Okay, so and so therefore it structures the type of struggle that goes on, and it's not and it never stops until we have a transformation of the kind of struggle that we're involved in. It never stops. And for example, one of the major areas where this phenomenon could be found in the last 30 years, of course, has been China. We had a tremendous increase in the kind of the factory, the days of the Manchester proletariat of the 19th century were repeated many times over in China in the last 30 years. And now, as there's been a tremendous struggle in China, much of the capital that was invested there is moving to other parts of the, to Vietnam, for example, back to Mexico. It's not a fixed matter. It's continually in motion, and it's a motion that's always, and I'm not. It's a motion that is rooted in struggles, and we have to. It's very important that we start there, because often, if you look at the totality of capitalism, you think that it's a kind of self-enclosed system that just kind of does its thing. But in fact, it's structured to respond to struggles, to be able to strategize how to basically defeat struggles. So it's not a self-acting system, although it looks like that many times. And economic theory often presents us a capitalism of this sort. So, anyway, here's my response to that. Okay? Yeah.
Unless Shay has something you want to say, but because I wanted to use Just Us as an example of this dynamic.
I kind of wanted to touch on that a little, actually, in response to like the effect that a strike in like a mining kind of position, of course, is very different than the effect of McDonald's workers striking. But I think that like what we really need to be focused on is what is important is that these workers are engaging in struggle. And like the effect that we're going to have, like we don't get to choose the conditions in which we work, we don't get to choose the conditions in which we organize. And so yes, it's gonna be a harder sell to get people to engage in that struggle when they know that they can very easily be ignored on the whole by society unless we start to get creative.
I guess I wasn't going to talk about Just Us, but I was thinking about like worker struggles in sort of like the global south or like developing world, or well, I don't know, there's like all sorts of politicized terms to use. I think it's also important to understand that like they're related, and so like in today's economy, you know, you have like the largest sector in North America is the service sector. Like all of McDonald's workers go on strike, it would be amazing. Would it shut down the economy? It's arguable, right? And so like what is important though is that like the base of our economy has been exported to like the global south, right? And that's sort of like what George, you were talking about, and it's like the exportation of exploitation. And I think it's also important to recognize that like the reason like that the workers like, you know, in mines in like Guatemala or whatever are working in conditions that like workers in North America experienced before the sort of like some of the material gains that unions managed to achieve through like the workers movement. And so it's like I think there's like a duality going on here where it's like, you know, the exploitation that workers in North America experience are like getting exported abroad as like global capitalism continue to expand and colonialism still exists, yada yada yada. And then also at the same time at home you have this like erosion of workers' rights. So that's why in like what I was talking about how like the workforce has shifted, it's like we don't even work in jobs that can be unionized. You know, we work as like Larry was saying, like, you know, as producers who are doing contract work, who are like self-exploiting, who are self-employed, and like this is also ways in which capitalism is like structuring itself to respond to struggle. Yes, would that be an accurate use of that term? Yeah,
I'm
so I
trying
think
to
it's also
divide
important
us.
to see that there's like a duality happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually think what's happened at Just Us may be conditioned by that. Maintaining our living standards, or increasing our living standards, but for the working class, just maintaining it in the developed countries is based on super exploitation of workers and producers in the global south. Just Us is a cooperative, but that's not the important point. That Just Us as an enterprise was founded in order to shift money to the producers, more money than they were getting, to the global south. Not just them, but it was part of a whole movement. But they're smacked right in the face with the contradiction, because I think that the primary goal of Just Us right from the start was always, the first goal was to take care as much as possible of the farmers and producers in the global south. And building a viable co-op, and one in which workers could participate and become members and be democratic, took second place. And that's one of the reasons they got themselves into the mess they got into. I'm not saying, oh, well, what they should have done is forgot about the farmers in the global south. No, it's a contradiction. But I think it really tempers what happened there.
Any other questions? Yes.
Two things. Shay, I have a question about the term wage slavery, in that I very much see it's such an analytically powerful term, and that it shows us that the opposite of slavery is not the freedom of capitalism. But I also wonder how much we lose in using that term in making too quick an equation between slavery and work under capitalism, clearly two pretty different things. And George, I really appreciated the way in which you got us to think about this more capacious sort of sense of work, but I wondered about struggles over the land. And in a settler colonial state like Canada, we have one of the most important social justice struggles going on is that of Indigenous struggles for self-determination. And that so often seems like a whole separate issue or separate conversation from the one that we're having here around work. And I just was wondering, given that you gave us such a wide sort of, encourage us to think so widely about what work is, what are your thoughts on connecting those two, unfortunately, too often disconnected things?
Sure. Yeah. No. I think that's an interesting point, or an important point that you bring up. I guess. I mean, I use the term. I mean, probably for propaganda purposes. You know,
Sure.
It's kind of fiery. I mean, my thoughts aren't even fully formed on this, but I've been reading this book recently called The Wages of Whiteness, and what it sort of talks about is how working class identity and like the development of the correlation between like identities of whiteness and like a working class identity. And I haven't finished it, so maybe if I had, I would have like a more in-depth response to your answer. But I think it is important in sort of like talking about those terms and like thinking about bondage, that we don't erase like race and how that plays into it, and also like that there are that white people approach like our historical development of working class identity is really different than it has for people who are racialized, and the different experiences to like bondage and freedom and wages is very complicated. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, a couple of things. Maybe I can add something about wage slavery, because I was interested in this term and where it comes from. And it's a 19th century term, and it actually has something of a technical character to it, because wage slavery, it is fiery and it has a rhetoric of its own, but it actually refers to the fact that workers were not free to organize collectively for their wages. There was a period of time, it's hard to believe, when in fact unions were illegal in the United States and in Britain for a good part of the 19th century. So the condition of workers, in a way, had a slave-like aspect to it, in the sense that you didn't have the power to gather with other workers, legally recognized power to gather with other workers and bargain for your wages, the way capitalists had that capacity when they created joint stock companies and so on. So that's something that, now, in my political development, the land question, although I came from a family of peasants from Greece, the land question was not a big question for me when I started out my political work. And the issue of work itself was central. Zero work, refusal of work, wages for housework, these were the terms that I developed my politics in the 1960s, or mostly in the 1970s, actually. So work was central, the class struggle around work was central. But after going to Nigeria for 5 years and experiencing life in an African society where there was a lot of common land, communally organized land, the question of land became more and more central to my thinking about capitalism and class struggle and the way in which struggle operates. And if you hold on for a minute, maybe I can explain. Because one of the things that Marx develops and points out is that the average person who was who had a high level of subsistence on the basis of cooperative work with his or her fellows is not going to go out and sell their labor power for anything or for low wages. In order for workers to become wage laborers, as Marx said, they had to be in a situation where they were not able to satisfy the conditions of sustainability and subsistence. All right? That clear? So the land question was really crucial for the development of capitalism, not simply just to control the growing of crops in a capitalist way, but also to be able to create a workforce is quite central. And this was very important here in the United States. It was very important in the Americas as a whole, was to, with the invasion of the colonial powers, they were very they not only wanted to take the land away from the indigenous people, but also to use that, to use the indigenous people as their labor force. This was part, and it was this part of the struggle that I began to recognize as an important part of class struggle that is rooted in the land. And the land question is a work question as well. You see what I mean? And the struggle for the defense of land was the struggle for the defense of a way of living that made it possible not to be in the relations of subordination that Larry talks about. So this is why land remains to this day one of the most important levers upon which struggle takes place. And certainly the indigenous people here in Canada have made that very clear at least to all of you here, who I know your politics has been deeply affected by their story. And they're basically saying, we want to be able to have a way of organizing a form of life that is not necessarily, that is not under the thumb of the capitalist. Okay? And so the land question, as I said, and that's why I think it is a real question.
Anybody else have questions for the panelists?
Larry,
A few minutes.
Larry had said you mentioned that the way people think was going to be quite central to the end of your presentation. Do you want to maybe speak a bit about that, the way people think?
No, I think I went through it, that the value of labor power is conditioned by how people think about what they're worth. And if you can destroy that notion, or if you can tear it down, if you can degrade that notion, the value will drop. So obviously, I was watching with my students, I'm teaching this course in collective bargaining, and we're watching this wonderful film from the U.S. Department of Labor that was shot in the 1980s. And they're demanding a 17% wage increase in each of 3 years. My students said, what are they, crazy? What, do they make that up? And I thought, no, back in the 80s, now there was double-digit inflation at a certain point, but we used to demand a lot more. What brought us to the point where if you make the cost of living, if you just come even with inflation, that's considered a big victory. if I get, let's say inflation's 2%, if I get 1.5, wow, that's a big victory. That's actually dropping 0.5% of my standard of living. I'm agreeing to that and thinking I'm lucky to get it. So something's happened to the way workers think about themselves and their radical imagination. It's being degraded. Now, farther than that I can't go because that's something I'd like to look into. What are the causes? I mean, there's all kinds of wage suppression strategies out there that governments and employers are using. But one of the successes is not just being the drop in demands, but the change in the way of thinking.
Is it possible then maybe the language of work also overshadows other ways of thinking about labor? Like I'm just wondering, we've been having a conversation around work, and George was saying that let's expand it to think about other forms of reproductive work, affective labor, emotional labor, these forms of labor, when you were moving us through the invisible forms of labor, moving us through movement like the feminist movement, the Black Panther, the race movement. You walked us through an alternative kind of movement that were also producing labor, or producing work that was, to use your metaphor, went behind us. They kind of like the cell capitalism goes behind us. And so I'm wondering, under the rubric of work, what else goes behind us when we are having this conversation? Just now put it out there as a question. Like, what else goes behind when we are thinking through the lens, the framework of work? What we render invisible that we can't even name as work. I just thought that it could be. Because you've been saying, I think if I were to put something out, I like what you were saying earlier on about what would it mean to think about recognition as labor if we move it from the realm of ethics and moral. So, and I think that the language of recognition is tied with ethics and is tied in almost this liberatory. And you were saying that let's move it to ethics, let's move it to labor. And so I'm also asking, there's this way that work is opening up, but what else does work? And work moves us into a specific way of the economy. Capitalism becomes the system through which we are now contending with. How does work, is there a way to, what question would we bring forth if we don't stick with work as the organizing principle for this project that we here seems to be committed to?
Okay, well, I think that there's a lot that goes on behind our backs in a capitalist society. And it's not only behind workers' backs, but also behind the backs of capitalists as well. And in that sense, you have to develop a particular type of optics to observe that, these processes that are taking place. one example that Marx uses is very much is an example that goes on behind our backs, is the question of the different varieties of labor power that exist, and how some of them are more highly valued than others, right? So, often under the rubric of skill. So we say, for example, some worker is more skilled than the other, therefore they get a higher wage, for example. That type of reduction is something that, so to speak, happens literally behind our backs, but it happens. And in fact, that type of the pricing of wage labor and the different kinds of prices of wage labor and how they are accomplished are quite basic to the way in which capitalism operates as a system. But it's not something that it's not something that is deliberated. It happens, and it means that the labor is being compared across the system. Right? And another part of the thing that was, when I speak about something that's going on behind our backs, is the invisibility of a tremendous amount of labor that takes place in our society. And this is, it seems to me, a very important part of the way in which whole universes of work are basically seen to be not work at all, but something that's quite natural, just happens. You see what I mean? It's, but what I'm trying to get at is that in our society, we have to be very sharp and continually be able to spot the very fast processes that are taking place. It's like subliminal processes that are organized so you don't see that actually the process is happening at all. And because if we did, then we might be able to put a halt to them. And that would be a major change in the way in which workers in the system can fight back.
Maybe one last quick question.
Yeah, I want to name some of these invisibility because I feel like coming from a feminist background, coming from a movement that fought for wages for housework and spoken about reproduction for many, it's not, we can name, I think the feminist movement, for example, has spoken about sexuality as well, particularly in terms of women's, that for women sex has become work, it's being organized in capitalism. Reproduction in the sense of procreation, in the narrower sense of procreation also is a whole field of work. And for example, in a field of struggle, like we began to, for example, reinterpret collapses in the birth rate as forms of strike, as forms of refusal of work. And in fact, they've been connected also with the capitalist attempt to organize migration, talking about how struggles connect. There's a lot of invisible struggle. For example, all of a sudden, in the United States now and in many other countries, the birth rate is going down. And that's not a natural phenomenon. It's a social process, and in many cases a process of refusal of the condition under which procreation is imposed on women. And there's a whole discourse again about sexuality. And of course, also domestic work. But I would suggest that you add domestic labor to this list of the value of labor power, because the devaluation of domestic work, which is immense amount of work, it has so many tasks, is probably the most fundamental source of the devaluation of labor power, you know, and that has been a terrain of struggle. For example, the whole issue of welfare in the United States, the attack on women on welfare has been a major attack on the value of labor power. Because in fact, there's been a declaration that housework, reproductive work, domestic labor is not work, and women have been labeled as parasites. So there is a really vast area that I think but as being named, I think the women's movement, among others, has brought out some of these questions, as made visible, you know, some terrains of work and terrains of struggle that in fact have historically been obfuscated and naturalized.
And I think, thank you for that. I think the idea of rendering something invisible also makes it, we produce that invisibility when we render it invisible. So
and that invisibility then becomes also the ground for the self-evaluation, how workers think of it, right? Because there is a whole process of social degradation. You know, social degradation, which is very, very important for racism, sexism. You say, oh, well, they're not getting wages, we know, because they're black. Or they are not getting wages because, well, that's women's labor, right? The whole, that racist and sexist ideology, you know, have a very material foundation. Very, very profound material foundation.
On that note, I think we should end because the gender reveal department will probably kick us out eventually. So on behalf of Platypus and everybody here, thanks a lot for your
like thunder and dump the bosses off your back. All the agonies you suffer, you could end with one good whack. Stiffen up, you ornery duffer, and dump the bosses off your back. Bum, bum, bum.